Have you ever poured years of your life into something? Sacrificed weekends, late nights, even your health, only to be erased when the success finally came? That happened to me. I built a system that became the heartbeat of my company, but when it launched, they toasted with champagne, handed out balloons, and erased my name like I was nothing. Then my director looked me in the eye and said, "Your bonus will not process." Policy stuff. That was the moment I realized, sometimes betrayal does not come as a knife in your back. It comes dressed as a smile, wrapped in the word policy. This story is not just about revenge. It is about self-worth. It is about remembering that no matter how small they make you feel, the truth is powerful, and the truth cannot be erased. So I ask you, what would you do if your name, your work, your very value was stolen from you? Would you walk away quietly? Or would you make them remember who really built the foundation they stand on? Comment your thoughts below, because I want to hear your story too. Now, I will share mine. Please take the time to listen to my confidences. The sweet and angry truth of how I turned betrayal into justice. My name is Hannah Cole. I am 37 years old, and I will never forget the day my company turned celebration into betrayal. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, and I never imagined I would end up building data systems for a global corporation. I studied computer science, worked my way through graduate school with part-time jobs, and eventually became a senior data architect. I loved building things from the ground up, finding patterns in chaos, and turning raw numbers into something people could actually use. For 2 years, I had been living and breathing one enormous project, a complete rebuild of the company's analytics platform, and that day it finally went live. The break room smelled of burnt sugar because someone thought it would be fun to rent a champagne fountain for the launch. The cork popped, the foam shot across the monitors on the wall, and everyone clapped like we had just cured a disease. Every dashboard lit up brighter than fireworks. Every graph sparkled with impossible numbers, and people cheered like children at a parade. The system was performing at 5 times our projected capacity, and for the first time in years, the company looked alive. I should have felt proud, but pride is fragile when you know the people around you see your work as theirs to steal. I stood back, my paper cup of lukewarm champagne sweating in my hand, and I watched the people who barely lifted a finger in this project pose for selfies. Marketing handed out cheap balloons, sales sang victory songs, and even executives who had once doubted me congratulated each other as though they had pulled the all-nighters and written the code. I let them have their moment, but deep inside I felt like a ghost at my own funeral. I was alive, but invisible. I had created the heartbeat of this company, yet my existence was already fading from the picture frames. Then Daniel Price, my director, walked over. He was 36, sharp suit, sharp grin, and the kind of man who always acted like he was 2 steps ahead, when in truth he was only parroting the work of people smarter than him. He patted me on the shoulder like a teacher congratulating a child and said, "Hey, just a quick thing. Your bonus will not process." Policy stuff. He said it with that careless tone, already turning away as if it were no more important than telling someone the coffee machine was broken. I froze. The noise of the room dimmed, like someone had turned down the volume of life itself. In that instant, something inside me went very still. I did not yell. I did not argue. I did not beg. I simply stared at the back of his suit as he walked away and thought to myself, policy was the word people used when they wanted to hurt you without admitting it. I was not just denied a bonus. I was erased. I had poured my life into a system that was now being celebrated around me, and the one thing I was promised, the recognition and reward, had been cut with the stroke of a phrase. He thought it was over, but what he did not know was that I never forget, and I never forgive. Revenge is not always loud. Sometimes it begins with silence, with a single spark in the middle of a celebration, waiting for the right moment to burn. After Daniel's words sank in, I walked back to my desk and stared at the stream of congratulatory messages filling my inbox. Colleagues wanted quick reports, charts, metrics to prove the miracle was real. My fingers moved automatically over the keyboard, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought about every night I had stayed until sunrise, about the weekends I gave up to debug broken pipelines, about the birthdays and holidays I missed. I thought about the migraine pills in my drawer, the empty coffee cups that lined my desk, and the silence of an office at 2 a.m. when I was the only one left. All of that sacrifice had been brushed away with one shrug and 2 words. Policy stuff. I told myself not to show anger. Anger was what Daniel expected, something he could dismiss as unprofessional. Instead, I sat in calm silence, but inside, a storm gathered. I could not help but remember the promises made during the early days of this project. I remembered how Daniel begged me to stay when I considered quitting 2 years ago. I remembered him telling me I was essential, that my contribution would not go unnoticed, and that there would be serious rewards once the system succeeded. Now the system was thriving beyond belief, and suddenly I was not essential anymore. I was a cost to be trimmed. I watched him from across the room, his Bluetooth blinking as he bragged to an executive over the phone about his system. He paced, smiling, completely oblivious to the fact that I was watching him trade my blood and sweat for his ego. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. He could not even tell the difference between Python and JavaScript, and yet here he was, basking in glory for an architecture he could not explain if his career depended on it. He had turned my brilliance into his mask. It was theft in broad daylight, dressed as leadership. The strangest part was how easily everyone believed it. The younger employees looked at Daniel with admiration, unaware of how little he had done. Even Cynthia Blake, the vice president of operations, nodded along with his words as if they were gospel. I realized then that people will choose the story that is most convenient, not the one that is true. The convenient story was that Daniel was a genius director who had led a team to victory. The truth was that I had carried it all on my back, but truth has a way of becoming invisible when the wrong people hold the microphone. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the city lights through my window. I felt hollow, like I had been scooped out. But under that hollow ache, something sharp began to form. I remembered the contract I fought to negotiate years earlier, the one Daniel had barely skimmed. He thought it was meaningless legal padding, but I knew better. It was not just a clause. It was protection. It was my safety net in case of betrayal. And Daniel had just cut the rope with his careless smile. He thought I would accept it. But what he did not know was that I had already set a trap in motion long before this day. He had not denied me a bonus. He had declared war, and I never lose wars I did not start. Monday morning arrived with a dull heaviness, the kind that presses into your bones before you even step into the office. I poured myself a bitter cup of coffee and opened the company newsletter, expecting the usual fluff about teamwork and vision. Instead, I found a glossy celebration piece about the analytics launch, complete with charts and architectural diagrams I had personally designed. Every color, every layout, every phrase was mine, but my name was nowhere to be found. Instead, the authors listed were Daniel Price, Cynthia Blake, and even a junior product manager who barely knew what an API was. They had taken my words, pasted their names above them, and presented it as if the system had sprung fully formed from their collective brilliance. I stared at the PDF, my hand tightening on the coffee cup until it nearly cracked. It is one thing to be denied money. Money can be replaced. But identity, recognition, and dignity, those cannot be bought back once they are stolen. Reading that document felt like watching myself vanish in real time. My work had become a faceless bullet point, my sacrifice a vague cross-functional effort. It was like I had never existed at all. A decade of skill, 1,000 sleepless hours, erased in 2 pages of corporate propaganda. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe my name had been left off accidentally. I scrolled through the fine print, through every appendix and diagram. Nothing. Not a single mention of Hannah Cole. But there was Daniel's smirk captured in photos, Cynthia's polished statements about leadership vision, and a quote from the product lead describing the system as a team-wide discovery. Discovery. As if I had stumbled across the architecture in a forest, rather than building it brick by brick from scratch. I closed the file before I threw my computer against the wall. The office was buzzing with congratulatory chatter. People passed by my desk with high fives and casual compliments, unaware of the storm raging inside me. Amazing work, Hannah. We did it, they said, as if they had been beside me during those endless nights. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile you use to cover a wound, and I nodded, but inside I kept repeating one thought. They do not see me. They never saw me. That afternoon, I overheard Daniel in the hallway speaking to another executive. His voice was smooth, confident, filled with pride that was not his to carry. He called the system our baby and talked about expansion plans, monetization strategies, and global rollouts. Every word was rehearsed, every syllable sharpened to make him sound like a visionary. The bile rose in my throat. I knew he had read none of the code, fought none of the battles, solved none of the critical failures. And yet, here he was, strutting like the architect of my world. That night, when I got home, I sat at my kitchen table in silence. My hands hovered over my laptop, and I opened a folder I had not touched in years. Inside it was a copy of the license contract I had personally negotiated with the vendor. I had fought tooth and nail to include one line, buried deep in legal jargon, a line that no one but me truly understood. It was my anchor, my safeguard. And now, as I looked at my name missing from the company's history, I understood its true value. They thought they had erased me, but in reality, they had already written their own downfall. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to show them. The following week, the office returned to its normal rhythm, or at least what passed for normal. Sales was already pitching the system to new clients, marketing was drafting case studies, and Daniel strutted through the halls like a conquering hero. No one noticed that I had gone quiet. No one asked why my smile had grown thinner or why I no longer joined the victory lunches. They believed I was simply tired. They could not imagine that I was sitting at my desk with a quiet secret, a secret written in black and white years earlier when no one else cared enough to read. 3 years before, when the company first signed its contract with the analytics vendor, Daniel nearly bungled the deal. He skimmed the red lines, skipped meetings, and treated the process like a chore. He told me to just trust legal and focus on coding. But I did not trust anyone to protect me. Not then, not ever. So I stepped in, staying late on conference calls, going line by line with the vendor's attorneys. I insisted on one condition, buried deep in Appendix 11B. It stated that if the designated technical lead, named explicitly as Hannah Cole, was removed from compensated employment, The license would terminate within 72 hours. At the time, Daniel rolled his eyes and called it overkill, but I had already sensed what he was capable of, and I wanted armor. Now, staring at the contract again in the quiet of my apartment, I realized how sharp that armor had become. They had denied me my bonus. They had stripped me of recognition. And in doing so, they had stepped directly onto the landmine I had planted. Daniel thought he had silenced me with policy, but what he had really done was sever the one thread keeping their license alive. The entire system they bragged about, the dashboards they paraded to investors, the metrics that drove every decision. It all hinged on my continued compensation. Without it, their empire was nothing but sand. I leaned back in my chair and let the weight of that knowledge settle over me. It did not feel like anger anymore. Anger burns hot and fast, but this was colder, cleaner. It was the kind of calm you feel when you finally understand that justice is inevitable. I had the trigger, and Daniel had already pulled the pin for me. I did not need to shout. I did not need to storm into meetings or demand attention. All I had to do was wait. The next morning, Daniel sent me a message asking for a new set of performance reports for the board. His tone was smug, almost dismissive, as if I were his assistant rather than the architect of the system. I prepared the reports, polished them, and sent them with no edge in my voice. Then I quietly opened a new folder on my desktop and named it Insurance. Into it, I began dragging copies of everything. Design drafts, Slack threads, architecture diagrams, and version histories with timestamps. Not out of rage, but out of preparation. The kind of preparation you make when you know the storm is coming and you want to watch it break without lifting a finger. They believed they had erased me, but they had not. They had only written me into the foundation of their downfall. And when the walls finally cracked, every piece of rubble would carry my name. The days after that revelation were strangely quiet. On the surface, the office looked the same. Emails, meetings, cheerful chatter in the hallways. But beneath it all, I felt the hum of a storm that only I knew was coming. I walked in each morning like nothing had changed, sat at my desk, and answered every request with calm efficiency. If Daniel asked for a chart, I delivered it within the hour. If Cynthia wanted a breakdown of performance, I prepared it with polished detail. To them, I looked cooperative, loyal, even predictable. But in my mind, I was simply buying time, watching the rope tighten around their own necks. What fascinated me most was how easily they assumed my silence meant submission. Daniel strutted past my desk as though the matter of my bonus had already been forgotten. He laughed with other managers about strategy and expansion, never noticing the way my eyes lingered on him. Cynthia congratulated him in meetings, praising his leadership in the launch. Even the junior product manager, barely old enough to rent a car, gave presentations about his contributions to the architecture. None of them realized that every report, every dashboard, every metric they now flaunted was legally hanging by a thread. And that thread was tied to me. At night, I would sit in my apartment, the city lights glowing against my window, and read the clause again. It was simple, brutal, and airtight. In the event that the designated technical lead, named as Hannah Cole, ceased compensated employment, the license agreement would be null and void within 72 hours. There was no gray area, no loophole, no escape hatch. If they refused to pay me, their entire system would collapse. I had created the heartbeat of the company, and without me, it would flatline. The thought filled me with a strange, icy satisfaction. I began preparing, not with fury, but with precision. I copied vendor communications, secured contracts, and encrypted backups of my architecture designs. I saved Slack conversations where I explicitly warned about licensing risks, and I timestamped every file. I wanted evidence, not revenge. Proof that when the collapse came, it was not sabotage but compliance. If they tried to accuse me, the paper trail would defend me. If they tried to silence me, the contract itself would speak louder than any words I could say. By Friday, the silence became noticeable. One of the engineers muttered in the break room about weird language in Appendix B. A project manager joked that legal probably skimmed it, but his voice cracked slightly when he laughed. I kept my expression neutral, sipping my coffee while the seeds of doubt began to sprout in their minds. No one asked me directly, of course. They thought I was just a cog in the machine, too obedient to be dangerous. That illusion was their comfort, and I let them keep it. When I left the office that evening, I felt a curious calm settle over me. The sun was low, painting the glass towers gold, and I realized the game had already shifted. They thought I was beaten, but I was already holding the detonator. I did not need to rush. All I had to do was let gravity take its course. By the next week, the strategy Daniel chose to deal with me became painfully obvious. It was not confrontation. It was not discussion. It was erasure. Slowly, quietly, he began cutting me out of the picture. First, my calendar invite to the morning stand-up disappeared. Then, access to the main analytics Slack channel vanished overnight. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some technical glitch, but the truth settled in quickly. Daniel was moving me off stage without ever saying the words. No fight, no email, just the quiet cruelty of exclusion. I watched from the sidelines as meetings continued without me. Presentations were given with my work, but not my presence, and decisions about the future of the system were made by people who could not explain how it even functioned. In one meeting, I overheard Daniel bragging about new optimization strategies that were nothing more than notes I had drafted weeks earlier. The younger staff nodded, impressed, not realizing they were applauding a man who barely knew how to open a database query. It was infuriating, but I let my face remain calm, almost detached, because anger would have given him the satisfaction of thinking he had control. What he did not know was that I had already begun my own quiet game. Each evening, I opened a private spreadsheet on my laptop and listed every single system that relied on my code. Daily revenue dashboards, churn reports, compliance checks for the board, predictive models for investor calls. All of them stemmed from the architecture I had written. By the end of the first night, the list had 23 critical dependencies. By the end of the week, it had ballooned to 79. Nearly all of them would collapse within 72 hours if the vendor pulled the license. I stared at that spreadsheet with a kind of clinical fascination. Daniel thought he was erasing me, but in truth, every keystroke I had ever made bound the company to me more tightly than he could imagine. I saved that file under a dull name. Something like Metrics Overview V6, and encrypted it. No one would think twice if they stumbled across it, but I knew it was a loaded weapon. Not because I intended to pull the trigger, but because Daniel already had. He had denied me my bonus. He had violated the clause. All I had to do was wait for the vendor, the lawyers, and the clock. The strangest part was how normal the office looked from the outside. Laughter in the hallways, donuts in the break room, small talk about weekend plans. But beneath that surface, tension began to hum. An engineer asked me casually if I had ever double-checked the licensing terms. A project coordinator whispered that she had heard legal was reviewing something serious. I only smiled faintly and kept typing. I wanted them to think nothing was wrong, that I was simply moving on, invisible. That evening, as I packed up to leave, Daniel passed by my desk. He did not look at me, not directly, but I caught the flicker in his eyes, that mixture of arrogance and fear that comes from knowing you are skating on thin ice. He thought he was winning, pushing me into silence, into irrelevance. But what he never realized was that isolation only sharpened me. Every meeting they held without me, every channel they removed me from, only made my silence more dangerous. Because silence, when wielded carefully, is not absence. It is power. The first crack in Daniel's carefully polished facade came on a Thursday morning. I was at my desk, sifting through log reports, when a new email appeared in my inbox. The subject line was polite and bland. Follow-up on licensing Appendix 11B. It was from Rebecca Nguyen, our company's lead counsel. She was 35, sharp, meticulous, and the only person in the building I trusted to actually read every line of a contract. She had CC'd me on her message to Daniel, asking him to confirm that the company was in full compliance with compensation terms tied to the analytics license. To anyone else, it was routine. To me, it was the sound of a scalpel being unsheathed. I sat back in my chair, my pulse steady, and read her words again. They were clean, almost surgical, but I could hear the weight behind them. Rebecca had found it. She had seen the same clause I had memorized years ago, the one Daniel dismissed as meaningless. She had recognized that it was not boilerplate. It was a tripwire. And Daniel, in his arrogance, had already stepped on it. For 6 hours, Daniel did not reply. His Slack status flickered between in a meeting and active, but the silence was deafening. Around me, the office hummed with ordinary activity, but I could feel the tension creeping in. Engineers glanced at each other, whispering about compliance checks. A project manager asked me if legal was always this picky about small stuff. I only smiled faintly and returned to my screen. I wanted them to believe I was as clueless as they assumed. By late afternoon, Daniel finally responded to Rebecca's email, though I was not copied on it. But I did not need to see the words. His face told the story when he passed my desk. His smirk was gone, replaced by tightness around his jaw, the look of a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was not solid. He tried to act casual, but his eyes darted too quickly. His laugh with Cynthia was too forced. For the first time, he looked like a man aware of gravity. That evening, I took a slow walk home through the city. The autumn air was sharp, the streets alive with noise, but my mind was silent. I thought about Rebecca sitting at her desk, pulling up contracts, highlighting clauses, cross-referencing payroll records. She did not need me to explain anything. She was already following the trail. The difference between Rebecca and Daniel was simple. Daniel skimmed, Rebecca read. And reading was all it took to set this whole machine on fire. When I reached my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my laptop. I reread the clause one more time, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to savor it. The words were clean, merciless, and unshakable. Termination upon non-compensated status of the designated technical lead. That was me. That was the heart of their system. And now Rebecca's whisper had turned the spotlight directly onto it. The silence was breaking, and soon the whispers would become thunder. The collapse began in the dark, long before most of the company's leaders were awake. At 3:12 a.m., the automated sales reconciliation failed to land in the CFO's inbox. There was no error trail, no bounce-back message, just silence. At 3:40, a junior analyst on the East Coast shift pinged the team channel, asking timidly if she was just doing something wrong because the dashboards were blank. By 4:00, yes, the DevOps chat erupted in panic. No one could access the analytics cluster. API keys were spitting out rejection codes. The logs were clean, but the system was already crumbling. By sunrise, the damage was impossible to ignore. Every executive dashboard across the company pulsed with the same crimson banner: license invalid, contact account lead. The irony made me almost laugh. I was the designated account lead. My name, the one Daniel had erased from every victory speech, was the only name that mattered now. Without me, their glorious system was nothing but dead screens and empty charts. When I arrived at the office that morning, the energy was completely different. Gone was the celebratory chatter, the champagne laughter, the victory selfies. Instead, the halls buzzed with tension. People crowded outside Daniel's office, whispering frantically, clutching laptops as if they could will the numbers back to life. Marketing had tears in their eyes, sales was shouting into phones, and Daniel looked like a man standing in front of a fire with nothing but a paper cup of water. He tried to act confident, telling everyone it was a minor technical hiccup, but his voice cracked around the edges. I made my way to the break room, poured a cup of burnt coffee into a chipped mug that read, "Trust the data," and sat by the window. From there, I could see the chaos unfold like a stage play. People sprinted between offices, engineers typed frantically, and yet nothing changed. The dashboard stayed dark. The system was dead. I sipped my coffee slowly, calm, invisible, almost ghostly. No one looked at me. They were too busy trying to fix something that could not be fixed without me. At 7:45, I saw Rebecca walk past with her black binder tucked under her arm. She did not rush, did not panic. She simply moved with the quiet confidence of someone holding the truth. She disappeared into the CEO's office, and minutes later, the emergency meeting was called. No Zoom link, no calendar invite, just in-person summons. I was not invited, but I did not need to be. My presence was already in that room, written in every clause of the contract, stamped on every invalid license error flashing across their screens. By 8:30, the tension had reached its peak. An engineer muttered under his breath that this could take the whole company offline. A project manager swore she had never seen investors so furious. Phones rang without answer, Slack messages piled up unanswered, and still the screens glared red. License invalid. Contact account lead. I smiled faintly into my coffee. They had erased me from their story, but the system itself had remembered who built it. And now, without my recognition, without my compensation, it was choosing silence over service. The blackout had begun, and there was no stopping it. By 8:30, the emergency meeting had gathered in the executive boardroom. From my desk in the corner of the open floor, I could see shadows moving behind the frosted glass. The tension in the office was so thick it felt like static in the air. Rebecca Nguyen was in that room, calm and composed with her black binder. Daniel sat across from her, pale and fidgeting, his trademark grin long gone. Cynthia Blake, our vice president of operations, looked rattled, chewing on the cap of her pen like a student unprepared for an exam. And at the head of the table was Martin Graves, the CEO, 54 years old, a man known for his polished speeches and icy composure. But even from where I sat, I could see the stiffness in his shoulders. The first words that carried out into the hallway were Rebecca's. I did not hear every detail, but I caught enough. Clause 11B, she said, firm and steady, like a judge reading a verdict. Termination upon non-compensated status of the designated technical lead. That designated lead is Hannah Cole. My name hung in the air like smoke, and the silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. No one in that room had an argument strong enough to erase those words. Daniel tried anyway. His muffled voice carried through the glass, defensive and panicked. It is just legal language, boilerplate stuff. It was never meant to be enforced. But Rebecca cut him off. Her tone was sharper now, surgical. It is not boilerplate. It is binding. The vendor has already confirmed it. Another heavy silence followed. I could imagine Daniel's face, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. For the first time, his arrogance had no footing. A few minutes later, the door opened. Martin himself stepped out, his face drawn tight, his phone clutched in his hand. He looked around the office until his eyes found me. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Then, without a word, he disappeared back into his office. I knew what was coming. He would not send a proxy this time, not an assistant or a junior HR staffer. He would call me himself. The call came that evening, long after I had left the office and settled into the quiet of my apartment. My phone lit up with a number I did not recognize, but I knew exactly who it was. I answered with a single word. Yes. There was a pause, a breath, and then Martin's voice, low and gravelly. Hannah, what will it take? No greeting, no pleasantries, just raw desperation wrapped in authority that no longer had weight. I let the silence stretch, savoring the shift in power. For years I had been overlooked, minimized, erased. But now the CEO of the entire company was asking me what it would take to keep his empire alive. And I had already prepared my answer. I sat at my kitchen table, the city lights flickering through the blinds, the phone pressed against my ear. Martin's voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the strain beneath it. This was not the polished CEO speaking to shareholders with charm and certainty. This was a man cornered, a man who knew the walls were collapsing around him. What will it take? He asked again, softer this time, almost like a plea. I opened the folder on my laptop that I had named weeks earlier, long before the launch. Inside was a document drafted with my attorney. It was titled Reinstatement and Breach Resolution Proposal. Every word had been chosen carefully, every clause airtight. I had not written it in anger, but in anticipation. I knew this day would come, and I wanted to be ready. I clicked it open, my eyes scanning the conditions one last time, and then I spoke slowly, deliberately, so he would not miss a single word. You will pay me every dollar owed, I said, plus a 45% penalty for breach. You will issue a written statement acknowledging my role as the architect of the analytics system, and you will read that statement at the next company-wide meeting. Finally, the license clause tied to my employment will remain in place until I choose to sign it over. Those are my terms. On the other end of the line, silence stretched. I imagined Martin staring at the numbers on the screen, his knuckles white against the desk. For years, he had built his reputation on control, on calculated risk, on never letting anyone see weakness. But now his company was bleeding out in real time, and the only transfusion was my signature. After a long pause, he exhaled through his teeth and muttered, "We should have just paid you the damn bonus." I did not laugh. I did not gloat. I simply replied, "You have until close of business tomorrow." After that, the vendor receives notice of breach and the system stays dark. Then I ended the call. No goodbye, no softening. Just the click of finality. The next morning, a wire transfer confirmation arrived in my inbox. The numbers were precise, down to the last cent, plus the penalty. Attached was a draft statement acknowledging my work, signed by Martin himself. The dashboards, of course, remained dark until I walked into the office 3 days later. I logged into the system with quiet authority, flipped the necessary switches, and within minutes the company's heartbeat returned. Cheers echoed through the halls. Sighs of relief filled the air, but this time no one dared erase my name. They knew better. 3 weeks later, I resigned. No drama, no speech, just a short letter and a calm smile as I walked out with my box of belongings. I had already lined up freelance contracts that paid better and came with respect instead of exploitation. The company survived, but they would never forget what happened. And Daniel? He avoided my gaze until the very end, his arrogance shattered. Sometimes revenge does not need fire or fury. Sometimes it is as simple as letting people trip over the traps they built for themselves. They thought I was replaceable. They thought policy was stronger than a person. But in the end, they learned the truth. Without me, nothing worked. And that was the sweetest justice of all. And that is how it ended. They thought they could erase me with a shrug and a policy. Instead, they learned the hard way that without me, nothing worked. I walked away, not bitter, but stronger, carrying proof that knowledge and preparation are the sharpest weapons you can have in a world that treats people as disposable. Here's the lesson I carry with me, and the one I hope you will too. Never let anyone convince you that you are replaceable when you know your worth. Protect yourself, prepare for betrayal, and never be afraid to remind people, quietly, powerfully, that your value cannot be erased. So I leave you with this question. Have you ever faced a moment where someone underestimated you and you proved them wrong? Share your experience in the comments. Let us remind each other that justice is possible and that sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply showing the world that without you, their system collapses.